Hello everyone, this is FIDE Master Dalton Perrine, and welcome to another chess video here today. In today's video, we're going to be talking about targeting weak pawns and pressuring them, and we're going to get to see how Magnus Carlsen was able to apply this concept in one of his own games. We're also going to get to see how two of my own students were able to apply this exact same concept of pressuring weak pawns. They were able to apply this exact same concept in their own games, and we're going to see how they were able to get some strong positions. Now, after looking at these couple of concepts in Magnus Carlsen and my two students' games, then we're going to see a final position, which is going to serve as an exercise or a puzzle for you guys watching the video to solve. And it's going to give you the chance to kind of implement some of these concepts that we've talked about throughout the video. Okay, so let's go ahead and get right into it. Our first game is going to be featuring Magnus Carlsen here. And this game is coming from the recently concluded World Blitz Championship played back at the very end of December 2019. So Magnus Carlsen here was playing black, and he's playing against another grandmaster with the name Alexander Predke. And in this position, I'm going to ask you to actually, first of all, go ahead and pause the video. See if you could kind of come up with or figure out what you might be working on doing in this position as black. So go ahead and pause the video and think about what you would do first of all. Okay, so hopefully you guys had the chance to pause the video. So this is a position, especially with the topic of targeting weak pawns and pressuring them. The first thing we have to do in a position like this is going to be picking out weaknesses or picking out targets in the opponent's position. Now, the way that I kind of define a weakness, or especially a weak pawn, is any kind of pawn that is not protected by another friendly pawn, or at least cannot be easily protected by another friendly pawn. This might include things such as isolated pawns, doubled pawns, backward pawns, and so on and so forth. So in this position here, there are two weak pawns that fit that category there. Those are going to be the pawns on c3 and on a2. a2 in this case is an isolated pawn. There's no b pawn that's to the side file of it. And the c3 pawn is what's known as a backward pawn. It is kind of backward or behind the d4 pawn in this position here. And at the moment, the c3 pawn is not supported by a b2 pawn or a d2 pawn or anything like that. Now, if we kind of compare the actual level of weakness between these two pawns, you really want to focus on the pawns that are easier to attack. So between these two different pawns, it should be kind of apparent that the c3 pawn is definitely the easier one for black to attack. First of all, it's on a half-open file. We already have a queen and rook lined up on the c file aiming towards the pawn. And if you compare it to the a2 pawn, this pawn is much more difficult to attack. It's not very easy for us to even add enough attackers to it to do much damage. However, with this c3 pawn in the position, this is a pawn that we want to kind of pinpoint and focus on attacking here. Now, one of the first things we want to do, and this is going to be seen by Magnus Carlsen in the game in just a moment, one of the first things we want to do when we see an opponent having a weak pawn is we want to make sure that we can kind of keep the pawn stationary. If the pawn is able to advance or move or capture or get off of that weak square that it was originally on, then it might not be a weakness anymore. For example, if this white pawn was able to one day move up to c5, then it would be protected by the d4 pawn, and then at least in that case, c3 wouldn't be weak. If this pawn was able to come up to c5, then in that particular situation, it would actually be the d4 pawn, which is now the backward pawn of the two. But what I'm getting at here is, if you have a target, you want to try and make sure it can't advance first. That way, it's kind of stationary. It's a lot easier to attack something if it can't move. So in this position, the first thing we want to do is try to blockade the pawn, or at least get some control of the square in front of it so that it can't advance. So in this game, black played the move knight to a5, which is a very strong move. It is controlling the c4 square, and it's also just opening up a discovered attack on the pawn here because we have the rook and queen combined together to aim at the c3 pawn. There is also, I will say, another option in this position, which does kind of end up happening a little bit later in the game. But there is a potential idea in this position of also making a different pawn break to create a different pawn weakness, and black could have made the move e5 here as well. The idea behind e5 is that, first of all, if the pawn does take, black can take back with the knight, and now we've essentially isolated the c3 pawn. It's not just backward. In this case, it's actually isolated, so moving it forward becomes even more difficult to do. If the pawn wasn't captured on e5, If white tried maybe instead to maybe tries to take on c6 first. If he tries to take on c6 first, there is an in-between move. Pawn takes d4. White takes back with his pawn. And once again, we've created another example of an isolated pawn. So we will see this idea pop up again in the game very soon. But this is something that that could have also been available here as well. But for the purposes of kind of targeting a weak pawn that's already on the board, rather than working towards creating one, there is already the presence of the c3 pawn being a bit weak. So black decided to immediately play the move knight a5, working to blockade it, prevent it from advancing, and target it. White went ahead and played the move rook to c1, and black played a little bit of a safety move here. He played the move b6, and there's no longer the chance for the bishop to hit the b7 pawn. Gets it off of that square, and he is just kind of making it a little safer here. But as we're going to see, this pawn on c3, and by a little bit of a connection, this pawn on d4, these are going to be the definite targets that black will work on attacking. So white plays rook f e1. He's attacking the e7 pawn real quick. Black simply plays e6 to prevent that. White played h4. And now black goes ahead and blockades the c-pawn with knight to c4. Now we might think, okay, the queen's going to move away, which it does. You know, the queen was attacked by the knight. And we might think here, okay, we're blockading the pawn, but if we're blockading the pawn, we can't really attack the pawn at the same time. It's kind of like the knight's almost getting in the way here. However, this is not always going to be the case. We will see in a little bit how the knight could easily move. Or what we can do as well is prepare the attack, kind of put a lot of force in the direction of the c3 pawn. And once we move the knight away, then it's going to be kind of a lot of firepower coming up on that c3 pawn. So let's see. Black went ahead and played queen f4, attacking h4 and poking around a little bit. White played g3. The queen moved back to f6. White played king g2, protecting the bishop. And now Magnus Carlsen played the move rook c7. His main idea here is simply to play rook to c8, double up the rooks, and then pretty soon he'll just move the knight away. Maybe he'll even reposition it to d6 and maybe even over to b5 in some cases to help attack this pawn an additional time. Now, the move in the game from white here that was played does kind of change things a little bit. But let's imagine white had played maybe like rook to c2. Maybe white works on trying to build more defenses around this pawn. Black would probably go ahead and just play rook to c8. White might play something like rook to c1. And then there's the kind of tactical possibilities that occur at this point. Black would now have the option of playing knight to a3 instead of going to d6, attacking one of the defenders of the pawn. Once the rook moves away, whether it goes to d2 or b2, black can simply take the pawn on c3. We've won the pawn. Once we win the weak pawn, then we're able to work on simplifying the position. We can just trade pieces, try to get farther into the endgame, for example, and look to use our material edge in the endgame phase. So doing something like this, essentially the trouble that white runs into is that his position becomes very passive. He's simply stuck protecting this pawn. Even if he doesn't like tactically lose it, maybe queen d3 is played instead. Black could go ahead and play maybe knight to d6, putting some more pressure on the pawn. Still can't advance it because black would simply capture it. If the rook maybe goes to c1, trying to help support the advance, then another key idea here would be a move like b5, for instance. Instead of occupying the square in front, we are protecting the square in front, making it more difficult for the pawn to advance. And once again, we might even set up a tripling up on the file. There might be rook to c4, rook to c7, the queen could come back to c8, and maybe an idea of b4 down the road, trying to attack the pinned c3 pawn. And the issue for white is that it becomes very difficult to constantly worry about this pawn and constantly defend it. He's simply in a very passive position. And if you can put your opponent in passive positions in a lot of your games, that's going to give you a very good winning chance a lot of the time. Now, the move played in the game, instead of rook to c2 or anything like that, it ended up that white played the move bishop to e4. And this does allow black this kind of second chance or second opportunity to make this e5 pawn advance. Black did play the move e5. And this, again, is looking to attack the d4 pawn. If d4 disappears, then c3 becomes isolated. And if instead he tries to protect d4, we have 3 attackers on the pawn. There's only 1 defender. If he adds a second defender, we can simply capture the d4 pawn anyways. Now, white could have played maybe d5, and some people might think, oh, he gets a protected, pass pawn. It's pretty well supported there. However, black could simply play something like, once again, rook to c8, knight to d6, and the pawn still comes under fire. And the knight is doing a really nice job blockading the d pawn in this case. The knight's kind of wrapping around it and doing a very nice job here. So this maybe is something that white could have done. In the actual game, he decided to play the move bishop to d3. And there is a tactical flaw to this. His idea looks like, okay, if the knight moves, then I'll take the pawn on e5. But if you wanted to, go ahead and pause the video here, see if you can find kind of the tactical reason that bishop d3 doesn't work. There is a way for black to immediately kind of take advantage of this move and win material. Okay, so hopefully you had the chance to pause the video. In this case, bishop takes c4 is not actually a big threat because black can always regain it with queen c6 check. So instead of defending the knight or anything like that, black simply went ahead and took on d4. White did take the knight, queen c6 check. He ended up trading queens. He took on c4. And now black is simply up a pawn, and he's going to win a second pawn here as well. The c3 pawn is going to fall. Black will be up 2 pawns in this rook endgame, rook and pawn endgame, and it'll be a pretty easy win. And as the game went along, that's essentially what happened here. He took on c3 and eventually was able to work the d pawn forward. White ended up resigning in this position because after he does give up the rook for the pawn, black is simply ahead 2 pawns once again. They're connected pass pawns, and they're going to just go down the board and win the game very easily. So what we're seeing from this particular game example is, again, focused on this idea of the opponent having a weak pawn in the position. In this case, it was the c3 pawn. We want to try to build our pressure on the pawn. We want to, first of all, try to blockade it, or at least control the square in front of it so that it cannot advance easily. And then we want to try to add more pressure to the pawn, attack it, and ideally look to, add enough attackers to it that it can't be adequately defended, win the pawn, and then look to simplify and win the endgame from there. Okay, so this is the Grandmaster game example. This was Magnus Carlsen showing a real good masterclass on how to play in a position like this when an opponent has a weak pawn. Let's go ahead and see one of my students' games here and see how he was able to have the chance to implement this, this concept of weak pawns and targeting them in his own game. Okay, so in this position here, it is black's move right now. Go ahead and pause the video. The first thing, once again, would be figuring out, first of all, where the opponent's weak pawn is in the position, and then trying to follow through with the ideas of blockading the pawn, building pressure on the pawn. See how you could do that maybe within a couple of move sequence here. Okay, so in this position here, the best way to play in black's shoes is to, first of all, highlight the importance of attacking the b2 pawn. This is the weak pawn in the position. b2 is a backward pawn. However, if the pawn gets to advance one day, if it gets to go up to b4, for instance, maybe after white plays rook c1 to guard c3 first, if he gets to play the move b4 one day, then the b2 pawn won't be a weakness anymore. So what black should first of all do here, he does want to target this pawn. It's on a half-open file, but he wants to blockade it first. So an important move here is to play rook to b3. After rook to b3, black can now work on doubling up on the b file, tripling up on the b file, and looking to attack this backward pawn that's weak in the position once again. The game may continue something like rook to c1, rook to b8, queen to c2, maybe now black plays queen to b5, and now the pawn cannot be defended anymore. Maybe white tries to play c4, attacking the queen moves away, and black will simply capture on b2 pretty soon, and he'll have won a pawn in this position. Now, my student in the game did earlier win a pawn, so we are kind of already up a pawn at this point, which is very good. We do have 7 pawns to the opponent's 6, but it's always good to win another pawn. There's no problem with trying to win more material, especially if it's taking into account the opponent's weakness and trying to. Okay, let's go ahead and see another student's example with a very similar idea here. Let's put this one on the board. Okay, in this position here, it's black's move right now. Black is kind of, once again, up a pawn already to start off with, but go ahead and pause the video here, see if you can kind of pinpoint the weakness or weak pawn in the opponent's position, and see how you would work on taking advantage of it. Okay, so in this position here, the weakness that I would kind of identify is this c3 pawn. Once again, it's a backward pawn, it's not supported by any friendly pawn, and it's also on a half-open file at this point. Technically, a3 is also kind of a backward pawn as well, but the difference being that this pawn is not on a half-open file. It is a bit harder to attack this. We could play maybe queen a4 to attack a3, but that's kind of about the only way we can attack the pawn. Now, an important thing we want to be a little careful about and probably not do in this position is a move like pawn takes b4. If we play pawn takes b4, white might have the opportunity to play c takes b4, and now there's no more backward a3 pawn. or sorry, backward c3 pawn. There is still a backward a3 pawn. However, the weakness is a lot harder to exploit, once again, because a3 is simply more difficult to attack, and it's also defended here. Now, once again, black would still have a better position. He's still up a pawn in this position as well. However, it wouldn't be as easy to take advantage of any kind of weak pawns here. So if we back up here, instead of capturing on b4, we want to try to prevent the advancement of the c pawn, because if we don't do that, white might be able to play c4 himself. If we just play something like rook e8, for instance, white might be able to play c4, and we're not able to take advantage of the... it's not really a backward pawn anymore at this point. So what black did in this position, black went ahead and made the move queen to d5. He didn't actually blockade the pawn, but it's a very similar idea. He moves the queen, and he's going to use the rook to blockade the pawn pretty soon, as we'll see. So white played queen e2, targeting a6. Black plays rook to c4, blockading the pawn, and also attacking f4 at the same time. Rook to d3 hits the queen, and the queen simply goes back to the c6 square. So this is an important concept as well. When you are looking to target a weak pawn, you don't really want the queen necessarily to be in the front, because a lot of the times it's hard for the queen to make the first capture. Usually there might be like a minor piece or a rook protecting the pawn. So you want to try to put a rook in front or have other pieces attacking the pawn as well, and have the queen kind of supporting those pieces. So we do have 3 attackers. The bishop on f6 is also helping out here, and there's 3 defenders. But what we're going to see pretty soon within this position is that black is going to be able to add more attackers than white can defend it. So white played queen e3, black played rook to c8. White plays queen f3, offering a queen trade. However, the problem behind this is that black went ahead and traded queens, traded on b4, and it might look like white is able to defend the pawn enough here. You know, how are we going to add more attackers to it? But kind of similar to one of the ideas we might have seen in the game with Magnus Carlsen, we have a pawn that can come attack the c3 pawn. You generally speaking don't want to let the opponent trade off their weakness with one of your own pawns, for instance. But the reason a move like the d5 and d4, which is going to be played in the game, the reason this ends up working in the game is because of the pin that we have on the c file. If white's rook was instead over on maybe like f3 and there was no pin, then playing a move like d4 would not be as good, because white could trade off his weakness and we wouldn't be able to attack it as easily. But because the pawn is pinned, black is able to play d5, d4. White cannot take on d4 due to the pin. White in the game played the move g5. There was a trade of pawns. My student threw in a check here, took on c3, and white ended up resigning in this position. The main issue is that, of course, the bishop is threatened. If the bishop moves away somewhere, black can then play something like maybe rook takes b4, or maybe simply play c2. That's probably the simplest here. Bishop to b2 is a big idea here. Bishop to f4. He can look to attack the piece that's blockading our very far advanced passed pawn, and we're going to win a pretty good amount of material from here. If he plays rook b3 to stop bishop b2, then bishop f4 simply is going to cause white to lose the game here. So from these couple of examples, Magnus Carlsen's game we see first of all, and then 2 of my students here, we can kind of summarize these lessons that we learned with a couple of different bullet points here. So let me go ahead and put some bullet points here on the board, and we'll see some things that we can kind of learn from ourselves. So let's first of all kind of take off these points here, and we will look to put the lessons on here. So the first lesson we see here is saying pawns tend to be considered weak when they cannot easily be defended by a friendly pawn. As we saw, in these cases, we are focusing primarily in this situation on c3. In other positions, it was on b2. In Magnus Carlsen's game, it was once again on c3. These are pawns that are not being supported by a friendly pawn, and so by that definition, they would be considered weak. The next bullet point here says, let me put it on here. There may be many different types of weak pawns, such as isolated pawns, backward pawns, and doubled pawns. Once again, by definition, an isolated pawn cannot be supported by a friendly pawn because there are no pawns on the adjacent file to it. A backward pawn has no defense from a friendly pawn. And doubled pawns, a lot of times, especially the front pawn of the doubled pawn pair, the front pawn tends to be a target a lot of times that you can attack, and sometimes it has no defenders. Maybe you can even pull away defenders or friendly pawns defending the front pawn of the 2. Okay, then this leads us kind of to a connection we see between all of these points. The first thing we want to do is blockade the weakness, put a piece in front of it. A lot of times, ideally, it's going to be a knight. Knights do like to kind of hop around pawns pretty easily. if you know the kind of the principle. If your opponent has an isolated pawn, use a knight to blockade it. But really, you can use any piece to blockade it. In some of these cases, we saw rook blockading. We saw a queen blockading, maybe in some situations, things like that. So first of all, blockade the pawn so that it can't advance and so that you won't be able to, the opponent won't be able to kind of move it and get rid of the weakness. The second thing there is to pressure the pawn. So we blockade it, then we look to pressure it. Bring a lot of our pieces towards attacking it, double up on a half-open file, triple up, involve a bishop, involve a knight, different things like that. Try to attack the weak pawn. Then the goal is, in this third kind of point in the arrows here, we want to capture the pawn. Of course, once we're attacking it, ideally we are able to bring enough pressure to it, maybe even involve one of our own pawns to attack the weakness due to a pin or something like that, and we can look to capture the pawn and win material. Once we're ahead material, then the final point here is to simplify. Once we're ahead material, we can look to trade pieces, get further into the endgame, simplify, as we saw Magnus Carlsen did. He kind of traded down into a rook and pawn endgame. He had extra material, and that allowed him to win the game pretty easily at that point. So through these couple of game examples, we're able to see this concept of targeting weak pawns and pressuring them. Let's go ahead now and see a puzzle or exercise position for you guys here to kind of check out in the video. So let's put the exercise here on the board. So in this position here, it is white's move right now. And I'm going to kind of leave this, like I said, as a puzzle for you guys or an exercise for you guys to work on your own. Pause the video and see if you can come up with the best move or at least a good sequence of moves that's going to kind of work along with the concept that we've talked about here of pressuring weak pawns. I will say the first person to get the correct answer or at least come up with a good reason behind their move and kind of following in line with the concept we've seen in the video, the first person to post that and that kind of answer in the comments below the YouTube video is going to get a shout out in the next video. I'll just mention their name and say that they got the right answer in the beginning of the next video that I make. So that's it for this video, though. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed it. Thank you for watching. If you did enjoy it, then don't forget to click to give the video a thumbs up. Click the subscribe button and ring the bell notification here on YouTube. That way you can get an alert when my next video gets posted. If you are interested in coaching for myself, then you would probably want to check out nextlevelchesscoaching.com. There's going to be a link in the description to the video. And who knows, maybe one of your own games will be featured in one of these future videos if you end up becoming a student and playing some good games. So that's it for me. Hope you guys have a good rest of the day, and I will talk to you guys in the next video. Bye, everybody.